Hello, sociologists. Welcome to the next lesson in the sequence. Now, the first lesson should have been 1.5, I guess, plus the assessment. Also, you might notice I'm using a different camera. The camera I'm using this time, and I'm hoping that the microphone works, is the one on the laptop because I've left my camera at work. Well done, me. But welcome back to the featureless white void on this wonderful well, I don't know about the weather in your area, but it's pretty wet here. So you'll have to excuse me if I keep looking vaguely downward. That's because I keep checking the picture and making sure that my hair doesn't look too awful. I mean, inflicting this upon you does seem rather unfair. Anywho, we started with the geekishly exciting, if I may say so myself, work on research methods. And I guess a little bit more framework before we begin proper looking at the different methods is required, because a lot of what we need to discuss is why sociologists use what they use and setting it up so you can do it in context. Because all of this stuff on research methods will turn up at the end of next year in paper 1, which is education. So primarily speaking, the research methods are in the context of education and educational studies. Now, you'll have to excuse me. I have not taught the education paper ever. And I can read a textbook the same as the next person, but it's different to having direct experience, and I appreciate that. So bear with me. A lot of this is more general. We'll talk about the structures. We'll talk about why sociologists do what they do, and you will probably see links that I don't see because you've done the education course and I haven't. So you'll see things go, oh, right, so that links into what we're learning with Mr. Cuthbert at this point, as it should. And hopefully I'll be able to spark those links without actually drawing those links because I haven't taught that course, Mr. Cuthbert did. So that's the basics and the background. So I suppose this way around, I can actually see what I'm doing without having to look too far down. So I guess that's an improvement. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to share. That's the whole thing. Let's try again. There it is. Bingo! Yes, we have the pets. Remind me, what do pets stand for? You can pause the video if you want to yell it at the screen. Do it now. Yeah, practical, ethical, and theoretical. Those are the 3 areas that you need to keep in mind when you're looking at research methods. Now, later I shall teach you, and this is the sort of thing that will get me in trouble on YouTube, but bear with me, there's a reason for this. It's an acronym. I shall teach you how to be a pervert. Bear with me. It's an acronym. It means something. But for now, we'll talk about pets. Practical, ethical, theoretical. Now, before I go any further, I have to talk about the process of getting information. Now, forgive me, a lot of this is rather simplistic, but it's explained with a different sort of edge to it, for want of a better phrase. And therefore, I need to explain what that edge is before we move on and try and use it. Oh, I've got to stop saying So the process. How does one find out what one wants to know once one has decided what sorts of methods we're looking at? The first thing you need to do as a sociologist is come up with a hypothesis. Hypothesizing, oh, it's a lovely word, isn't it? It makes it sound very, very pompous. What it means is coming up with ideas. A possible explanation that can be tested using evidence is the dictionary definition of a hypothesis. So you might say, well, I believe family size is linked to educational development and achievement. Okay, cool. How is that linked? What is the link? Is it a causal factor? Is it a corollary factor, i.e. 2 things happen at the same time because of the same things that affect both? Or is it a positive? Is it a negative? What is positive? What is negative in this situation? And so what you need to do is come up with an explanation that links these 2 concepts, educational achievement, family size, together, and then make sense of that link. So, in bold, I have a potential hypothesis. Differences in family size cause differences in achievement. There's our hypothesis. We know there's a link, and this suggests it's a causal link, that differences in family size will lead to differences in attainment and achievement because that thing makes this thing occur, or rather that thing affects this thing. So you need to work out what that is. Now, if that is the case and you're proposing to a researcher a null response, something that says, you know what, there is no link, is just as helpful as something that proves that there is a link. After all, before the studies were undertaken, we wouldn't have known. It was an assumption that family size was affecting educational achievement, and then you went out and did some research, or the researchers went out and did some research and found there was no link. That's good. We've now learned something. We've learned that family size does not affect educational achievement, and therefore the assumption that perhaps it might was wrong. So a negative response, a study that proves there isn't a link in the hypothesis, is actually quite a powerful thing. Now, if you're a positivist, and you may remember me using this term earlier, don't worry, you don't have to remember it too much, but it's worth knowing. If you're a positivist, this is great. They go, yeah, absolutely. We're all about trying to find out general rules of societal cause and effect. We are essentially engaging in a science when we undertake sociology. Sociology is the science of understanding how that weird thing, society, actually works. And therefore, finding out cause and effect through a hypothesis not only sounds scientific, but actually is scientific. And proving a negative is just as important in sociology as it would be in science, because sociology is a science. And once you find out what those links are of cause and effect, then you can apply them to anything you like. And speaking of applying, one of the things you'll notice about this course is you have to keep applying, you have to keep giving examples, which you already have in your educational work. So don't worry. There's another alternative, of course. You don't have to have a hypothesis that has a specific explanation. You could have a more general aim of your study. And an aim is different in that it sets the tone of the study, it sets out what is trying to be achieved, and it does not presuppose any kind of relationships. So your aim might be, I would like to find out what connections there are between family size and educational achievement. Simple as that. We haven't supposed anything particular there. We haven't suggested that it makes differences. We just said we're going to look at what the relationships are between family size and differences in achievement. And you're like, surely that's the same thing, sir. I say, well, it's not really. One of them implies that there kind of is an assumption that the connection is cause and effect, whereas the other one implies there might not be a cause and effect connection, but there might be some connections or some relationship between the two that we don't know where it's going yet, and we don't know what to hypothesize yet. So in this sense, when you've got a general aim, the idea is to gather data to understand something, and therefore you can make hypotheses, that's the plural of a hypothesis, later. So for example, what is the educational achievement of children in different family sizes? That is a general aim. What are the relationships between the two? Now, interpretivists, the other kind of sociologist, think this is really funky and groovy. They do like their aims because ultimately it doesn't impose anything. The researcher doesn't come with a presupposed idea and instead investigates what the relationships might actually be, learning new things for the first time, if you will. And that's an interpretivist view. Now, I am perfectly honest here, I thought of myself as a positivist, but the more I look into this, the more I'm thinking maybe I'm actually an interpretivist. So I don't know. Be aware. Yeah, I could be tricksy and false, and I wouldn't even know that that is the case. Hang on a minute. My face is right in that corner over there, and it's going to remain in that corner for you. Will it get in the way of the next bit? Because the next bit I'm going to talk about is how you operationalize a concept, which again makes us sound awfully clever and pompous while saying very little. There we go. I just get rid of my face. I'm sure you're breathing a sigh of relief right now. So what on earth do I mean by operationalizing a concept? Okay. So any idea, any hypothesis requires a working definition of what is meant by various ideas and approaches. The obvious example is this: working class pupils achieve lower qualifications due to parental income. There is a hypothesis that you could research. And it runs into problems when you try to make it measurable. Now, qualifications are easy. They're obviously measurable. These days, you've got grades at GCSE and you've got letter grades at A-level. It's very, very clear and very easy to compare those. Furthermore, all those grades come with what we call uniform mark scheme scores, or universal mark scores, UMSs, meaning that they can be compared to one another regardless of what the grade is. So if you want to compare something that's a bit more vocational and doesn't have a grade value in the same way, like, I don't know, comparing BTECs to A-levels, then you can do that through the UMS. So the system is set up so you can actually make those comparisons. It is quantifiable. It is measurable. Okay, sir. So what? You've just told us that we have to operationalize the concept. There doesn't seem to be any concept there that I need to operationalize, whatever that actually means. You just said it was measurable. What's the problem? The problem comes in, okay, what's meant by working class? At the beginning of the year, I asked my set whether or not you're working class, and only one student was brave enough to say they were. And then I would argue that perhaps they aren't by other definitions. And perhaps some people who said they were middle class are working class by other definitions of what middle class and working class are. It all depends who's doing the asking, I suppose. So you have to operationalize what is meant by that idea of working class. You've got to define it somehow. You've got to say what it means. Now, that sounds like a no-brainer, but too many people, and many people actually in society, will assume they mean certain things when they use certain terms. So until you know what you're looking for, until you know how to define the topics and the ideas that you are using, you don't really know what to ask or who to ask of it. So in this case, when you're talking about working class pupils, you need to talk about the parents rather than the pupils. You need to talk to them and find out what job they've got. And once they've got a job, one way of operationalizing working classness is to work out what jobs you consider to be working class and what jobs you consider to be middle class. The difficulty here comes when researchers define things differently, which means you've got to read the study and you've got to understand what the study is about. Now, at this level, you don't have to worry too much about the studies we've shown you. Rather, you save this for the theoretical portion of paper 1 on education, where you're talking about research methods, and you mention it as an issue with some examples to prove the point. Now, don't worry, I'll get on to providing examples. I'm just setting the scene here. The example that the textbook refers to as a sort of for instance is, how do you define an office worker? That is, just someone who works in an office. Is it data entry? Is it secretarial? Doesn't matter. They work in an office. They're a generic office worker. Are they middle class? Are they a clerical worker? Or is this the new definition of the working class, because they have to work and if they don't, they can't survive? What definition would you use? Now, don't worry, there's no right answer. It's a for instance to prove the point. It proves that the children of these generic office workers might be considered both middle class and working class, depending on who's doing the viewing. And that's why it's important when you're writing a study or you're carrying out research to write your definitions. And when you're using these studies, higher levels than this, you look at those studies and find out what their definitions are. Now, don't worry. For the most part, when they're used as examples in the work that you've been doing so far, that work has been done for you. So you don't have to worry about going through your notes and going, well, what if? But you can use those studies to make the point you want to make in an essay, to say that they've defined them slightly differently. And perhaps you already have some information on that already. Now, positivists believe that operationalizing concepts is incredibly important. You can see why I think I'm a positivist given the way I've described it, because they say, well, no, you've got to be able to label things. Labels are important. That's not to say people are defined by their labels. Rather, labels allow us to categorize things and make sense of the world and put it into scientific, neat boxes. I like neat boxes. You'll notice most of the time I have straight boxes. It's quite unnerving in sociology where I've ended up with curved edges. I know it's Makes me uncomfortable. But the point is this, I'm sure it looks very pretty. The point is this, I like labels. I like knowing what is working class. I like knowing what is middle class. I like knowing, well, like if we're going to go into it, points to non-existent mug. I'm autistic. I like my categories. I understand them. It's why I like cars. Is that car a Vauxhall or is it a Peugeot? Is it a Ford or is it a Range Rover? These things make it easy to identify cars and then to box them up in separate little boxes that I can categorize, or perhaps even by color. As long as you've got something you can use and explain. Do blue cars go faster than red cars? Well, it depends what type of car is painted that color. Do you see my point? So to my mind, yeah, positivism. But then you've got interpretivists, and they say, well, yeah, that's all very well, but it doesn't matter what category they are objectively, because there is no objective category. When you look at things like working class or middle class, perhaps there is a category you can impose that you might believe, but what's more important is how people see themselves. If someone sees themselves as working class, we've got to find out why and what that means to them. Why do they decide that they were working class? Whereas if someone defines themselves as middle class, you have to work out what it means to them, because that way you can make sense of why they define themselves as middle class. And arguably, that's more important than imposing a rigid system upon the world, because then you learn more about why people do what they do and why people say what they do. And often, therefore, say interpretivists, you don't need to operationalize concepts. Rather, you need to change your question to make sure you take into account the fact that these are self-defining. So you might say, pupils who believe themselves to be working class achieve lower qualifications, and that this is linked to parental income. That would be a very different hypothesis and would be more open, I feel, to interpretivists than the positivists who say, no, we just want to know whether working class pupils do better or worse. Do you see what I mean? Now, you can see the advantages and the attractions of both. Speaking as a me, the attraction of, well, working class pupils do worse is working out, well, all right, we need to know who we need to find in an educational setting and to apply that and use that to help us with our teaching and to help us with our support for those students. Whereas you could argue that's what really more important is how people see themselves. So that way, when I get a working class student, according to one definition, arrive in year 7, I don't automatically assume that because they are working class, they will do less good than a student who believes themselves, or a student who is actually middle class. If both students see themselves as middle class, then that would change my approach, would it not? Whereas if both students saw themselves as working class, then that would also inform my approach. So they both have merits. I don't think there's a right answer, but I hope you understand what the difference is. And if you don't, pop a comment and ask. We'll be able to explain further, I'm sure. Will that work now? Probably not, because why would things work? Yes. Next, we do a pilot study. So once you've decided what idea is you want to view, is it an aim or is it a particular explanation? Once you've looked at the concepts and decided what you want to do with them, do you want to find out what people think they mean when they use those concepts? Or do you want to impose a meaning upon them because you're trying to find a particular relationship between two different things? You then have to decide, okay, and how are we going to get the information we require? The process, the method of study, if you will, hence research methods. Pilot study, I looked up a picture of pilots, and of course I picked the first female pilot of a Boeing 737 I could find, because that I thought would mess with people's perceptions. Because usually when you think of pilot, you think male. And usually when you think of female pilot, you think of someone posing in a pilot's costume rather than an actual Dutch pilot. This is from her own website. She blogs about what she does. So here we are. It's a female pilot on an actual 737. Actually going through pre-flight checks. I liked that. It wasn't a stock image. So messing with perceptions. Pilot scheme. I also just like the joke of the fact that the word pilot was in pilot scheme. So a pilot scheme basically allows you to test out surveys or test out questions for interviews. And I haven't talked about those methods yet. Don't worry, I will. But before you do this, how do you know what to ask? So, for example, later in the course, I'm going to introduce you to Louis Theroux if you haven't already met him. And he takes part in participant observations, or rather long-form interviews that are unstructured. So he goes to meet with people that he wants to learn about, and he asks questions based on what he sees, based on what's going on around them. And he will ask the questions that occur to him when they do, and he'll ask follow-up questions based on what the answer to the previous question was. And something about Louis Theroux, which I've never fully understood, but is obvious when you watch him, is that people just trust him. The people he talks to are prepared to talk to him. He has this rapport with the people he talks to, in that he never seems to take the mick, he never seems to threaten them, and they therefore are perfectly happy to share answers with him. He has that ability. Now, a lot of it's editing, I understand that. But also, he just has that personality. He's genuinely interested in listening. And you could argue that he doesn't need a pilot scheme, but perhaps he does. Each time he'll get better at what questions he needs to ask the next person. You could argue that every single thing he does is kind of a pilot scheme for the next. So whilst he doesn't have a set of questions, he might have a set of beats that he uses to get to know people. He has a method, he honed it somewhere, that we would call a pilot scheme. Sometimes they're formal, sometimes they're informal. The textbook gives the example of Young and Wilmot, who you may remember from Families and Households in 1962, where they did their survey of London's docklands to try and find out about changes to family over time when we're talking about division of labour and isolated conjugal roles. They did 100 pilot interviews before they began, basically just making sure that people understood what was meant by the questions they were asking, and that the answers they were getting approximated what they were trying to understand with the question. Because if they didn't, then the question was at fault. They needed to change the question and tweak it to make sure that they got what they needed. So for their interviews, they tested with 100 people just to find out what people actually said and understood by those different terms. Why so many? Why so serious? Why so many? Well, you need a fairly large pool to make sure it's not just an individual who doesn't understand a question, or you came across a live one. You've got to sort of have some form of numerical data to make sense of it. And what it does, it allows you to change questions or just change the approach in how you ask them. Going back to Louis Theroux versus Young and Wilmot actually worked out with the questions because they were scripted questions. Louis Theroux works out his approach and how best to do things. So, for example, if I don't know if you noticed this over Christmas, there was a public speaker reacting to people like PewDiePie and Jacksepticeye. Bear with me, I'm going somewhere with this. And he looked at what they were doing as a pilot study as to what he needed to do on YouTube in order to gain followers. So if you watch the videos where he reacts to them first, and then watch the videos where the people he's talking about, PewDiePie and Jacksepticeye, react to him, one of the things he points out is the head on the side for empathy, the double shrug, meaning that you're going to talk about things honestly. And he was pointing out that a lot of public speakers try for years to gain these techniques, and here they are naturally on the internet. And then PewDiePie and Jacksepticeye respond to that, saying, well, I didn't know I was doing that. These are things that I just do. And of course, they have a talent, right? And then, interestingly, he then reacts to them. And you can see in his reaction that he starts trying to emulate them. Pilot scheme, to see what works, right? To see what resonates. And that allowed him to change his approach. That was an approach, not a series of questions. So Young and Wilmot worked out a series of questions. They could use an interview and work out whether it got what they wanted. People like Louis Theroux work out their approach and how to present themselves so they get what they need to know. All right, I've talked a lot about gaining samples and ideas. So how do you get a sample? Now, this is quite dry to a lot of people. I love it. It's the sort of thing that really, really, well, excites me on many levels academically. So here are the basics in a dark grey box, because everything in a dark grey box I find exciting, but I recognize that other people find it just very dry and boring. So what are the basics of a sample? What are the basics that you need to know? Well, first of all, studies aim to explain all of the population. Ideally, a study can be generalized. And if it can't be, it's doing something specific. So, for example, in Families and Households, to make a very clear case, Families and Households, you've got Young and Wilmot were trying to explain all of society and all families, as was Parsons. as was Charles Murray, as was, I'm trying to think of anyone else. Oh no, I've backed myself into a corner. What's her name? The housewife role, Anne Oakley. All of those people were attempting to explain something wider in society. In your most recent thing on government policy, some of you started talking, I've had some questions in already, some of you started talking about the instance of house husbands, for example, arguing that because you learnt about it, it must be a generalizable thing. It must be able to apply to the whole of society. But that's not always the case, is it? Sometimes, like Stacey, for example, with the divorced extended family, they're finding something very specific, very small, that might not be generalizable anywhere, but is a thing that is interesting in and of itself because it tells us more diversity than we previously thought. So most studies, generally speaking, attempt to explain all the population, or at least all of one particular group or all of one particular area. But the trouble is, you can't always study everyone. For example, if we're going to contextualize, and this is mainly in the bounds of education, I could look at a particular class, for example, and take 30 students and do a longitudinal study of those 30 students and know pretty much everything there was to know about that class within 3 years. That would be really interesting. But it wouldn't be terribly helpful if I wanted to use it for anything apart from proving a point that you can't do anything with generalized groups of students, maybe proving a negative. If I wanted to apply it to the whole of the students of the UK, for example, I heard a figure over the Christmas holiday that there are 650,000 students in the UK taking exams this year. How would you do a study on all 650,000 to work out what was necessary for exams and for teacher grades at the end of the year and actually report back in a reasonable time frame? I mean, sure, you could study all 650,000 and find out what the experiences have been over 2 lockdowns, but you wouldn't find out the information quickly enough in order to come up with an effective response by the summer to know what to do with their exam grades. Do you see what I mean? So, time and expense, knowing that you've got a time frame in which to get it by the end of the summer, earlier if possible, so people know what they're working towards. And you've got the expense, you've only got, say, a couple of million to throw at this. You need to sample that student body somehow. You need to make those numbers smaller so they're usable. And it needs to be as representative as possible in order to make sense of the whole population. Otherwise, you'll do something that only benefits or only works with a small group of students. And you want something that'll work for all students or most students, because nothing will work for all. And where it doesn't, you want to know what those outliers are. Do you see what I mean? So you need to sample. You need a smaller than 650,000 basis to work from. And you need to know where to draw them from. So where do you start getting your sample from? Now, the reason this is a big deal is in 1936, there was a political poll done in the United States of America trying to work out who would likely win the presidential election. Would it be Landon or would it be, that was a Republican candidate, or would it be the Democratic candidate, Roosevelt? Now, you and I both know that Roosevelt was an incredibly popular president because you know a little bit about history or you've heard of his name before, and he ended up leading the USA in the Second World War. Furthermore, he brought in something called the New Deal. He's a big cheese when it comes to American political history. He won by an absolute landslide. Now, a group of people trying to work out who people were going to vote for decided that they were going to use the phone book as their sampling frame. So you've got the whole population and you narrow it down into a sampling frame because you can't cover the whole population. You've got to cover something that's got a list that covers most people. And the phone books were pretty large in the United States in 1936. They were enormous. It was assumed, therefore, there were a good a place as any to start. And you could pick people from the phone book, get in contact with them over the phone, and then ask them how they were going to vote. And they did. And they discovered that Landon was going to win by a landslide and that Roosevelt wouldn't get in on it. But Roosevelt won by a landslide. What was wrong with their method? Well, quite simply, in 1936, only rich Americans owned a phone or had their names registered in a phone book. And as a consequence, they only spoke to rich Americans who didn't really feel the burn. Also, it wasn't most Americans. The sampling frame was upwardly skewed when it came to what they were after. And as a consequence, they completely missed what was under their noses. And of course they did. And it shows the importance of choosing your sampling frame. So when you're choosing a sampling frame from schools, how do you therefore get a sample that covers all the different walks of life you're going to need? So for example, if you're choosing people just from Duffield, you're not going to get those people that don't necessarily have technology or parents with books. You're not going to get those people that are homeless. You're not going to get those people that have recently undergone huge cataclysmic changes to their family necessarily. You're not going to get the super rich. You're not going to get any indication of what private schools are doing. You're not going to get any indication of what's happening on a primary level if you're just doing the secondary school that is Ecclesbourne. So your sampling frame has to be carefully chosen. Once you've got your sampling frame, how you're going to pick your people, where you're going to get them from, which isn't going to be everybody, I get that. So are you going to use like electoral returns? Are you going to use the phone book again? Are you going to use, I don't know, internet databases? Once you've chosen your sampling frame, how are you going to pick from that sampling frame? Because even the sampling frame is going to be very large. So taking the example of an online database, you may end up with a list of, I don't know, 300,000 students that have previously used this particular resource. Okay, fine, you think that's going to be cross-sectional, but 300,000 is still a lot. How do you choose who you're going to get in contact with? This is called sampling technique, and this is where I get excited. First and foremost, you can do it literally at random, and it's the most simple method you have. It's the simplest thing where you can just go and pick some people. That's it. You could assume that because you've got a sampling frame that covers most of the population, you're going to get a reasonable coverage of the population just at random, and that works, but it only works if the sampling frame is big enough. And then that poses its own problems to getting a random sample from it. These days, you've got algorithms that can do it for you, but to what extent are they random? So what you can do is use a systematic random sample. Now, a systematic random sample means that you take every nth name on the list. N in this case is a mathematical term meaning a particular number. So for example, using electoral rolls, that's people who are on the roll to be elected, and they're publicly available lists of names of people living in a particular area. You could do what Young and Wilmot did and simply pick every 16th person on the roll. Done, dusted. It gets you the number you need, and it's broadly speaking as random as you can get, whilst also trying to cover everything because it's alphabetical, and therefore you can go through the alphabet, etc., 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 rather than just picking the first 10. Do you see what I mean? There's a procedural element to it. So that's systemic or systematic random sampling, which a lot of people use and is largely successful if you just want to get a broad cross-section. The next one is, all right, but I want to know specifically about different groups of people. And I can't be certain that taking the 16th person on every list or every 16th person on a list of students is necessarily going to return to me the numbers and the sorts of people I want to know about. So what you do is you do a stratified, random, systematic sample. And what you do, therefore, is you break down the population into different quotas, different types, and you work out the percentages of what they are. So I don't know, you work out that 30% of students in the UK can be defined as working class, and therefore you take 30% of your sample from working class students after you've broken down the population as working out which is in what class based on previous data that's already been selected. Does that make sense? So you're relying on other people collecting that data for you to earn mine. If that data is not available, or you're suspicious of it and find it dodgy, you're left with a quota. You know the rough percentages, and therefore you keep going until your researchers or yourself have filled that quota of people that fit certain qualifications. So the way I like to think about it is, if you're in the middle of the street in Derby or Nottingham with a sort of survey on a clipboard, and you're looking for particular types of people, I want you to find 15 women with blonde hair and blue eyes and ask them the following questions to see whether ethnicity plays any role in how they respond. I also wish you to find 16 of women with brown hair and brown eyes, and 12 women with not white skin that is also not Asian. Do you see what I mean? And until you get that quota, you've just got to keep going. Maybe you just don't see that many people that day, and you get nothing that day because none of them fit the qualifications of the appearances you're looking for. Tough. You've got to go out another day. So it might provide you with a much more nuanced look at society, but you can see how this would exponentially increase time. And again, with students, it would be more difficult to work out a quota system, though arguably easier if you're picking it off respondents, because I don't know if you're aware, at the beginning of the year or when you update your data, one of the things you've got to take are things like ethnicity or things like background or jobs and what have you, and you've got to keep updating that. So theoretically, it's easier if that data is already collected. But then you run into problems there too, which is why you might go down to the quota, because when it first was brought in the 1990s, one student, I was a student too, in my class, decided to respond that they were Afro-Caribbean because there was nothing to stop them doing so, which I guess was a fair point. They weren't. And therefore, you might have to check the data. So once you get your sampling frame, you get your sample using your sampling technique. You then send out how you're getting that information. Maybe you're doing long-term interviews. Maybe you're doing long-form, interviews. Maybe you're doing participant observation. Maybe you're doing surveys. Maybe you're doing questionnaires. Doesn't matter. However you're doing it, you will always find that the sample doesn't get back in full. There will be the respondents, the people that actually take part, which I've shown by a little ibuprofen dot, because I like that color. Once you've got the respondents, well then, you need to decide if they're representative. Now, they should be if you're following any of this sampling technique here. But sometimes you will go for non-representative samples very deliberately. And there are various reasons why this might be so. First and foremost, there might be practical reasons. You might not know your population. So you might be looking for a particular characteristic in students. I want to know how many people play Fortnite. And there's no way really of I want to know about Fortnite users and their response to remote learning. Well, we don't know the population. We don't know how many students out there are on Fortnite. We know it was popular a couple of years ago, but do we know accurate figures for who's on Fortnite and who isn't? We don't know. Therefore, any sample we draw to learn about this is going to be non-representative because we have no way of making it representative. There might be no complete lists. So the example given in the textbook to prove a point is if you want to learn about criminals' attitudes to things, well, not all criminals are convicted. People break the law and are not convicted, and their data is, well, where is their data? So therefore, any attempt to gain a representative sample will fail because you're either going to get those who are convicted or those who aren't convicted or somewhere in between, and you're not going to get them all. And therefore, you won't necessarily find out how criminals think. Or in the case of schools, something similar may occur. You may want to know about people who've broken school rules. Well, all you'll find is those that have been recorded by the school, i.e. those who were caught. You're not going to find those who weren't. So it's not really going to tell you much. Ditto with bullying. What do you do? What do you want to, if you want to find out why bullying takes place in schools and what relevance that has to educational achievement, you're not going to find from school data alone all the bullies, nor indeed all the bullied. You don't know the population, and no one's going to come forward because who's going to say they're a bully? Do you see what I mean? And finally, you may end up with refusal to participate. Some students may say, well, no, I'm not going to answer questions about sexual assault outside the classroom because it may convict me in later life. And they've got a valid point there. They might feel you've got to share that information with the authorities. And let's be honest, you probably would. So a refusal to participate, and some people might have nothing to hide at all, but just don't want the possibility of being tainted by the study. You don't know, or they didn't respond, therefore they're clearly a sexual predator. It's not how it works. So you're going to end up with a non-representative sample just by that. So even if you do everything right, you may end up with a non-representative sample. So what do you do about it? There's two ways to fix it. You can either snowball sample when you don't know your population. So you find one or two students that are on Facebook, Fortnite, maybe by going on Fortnite and asking around, and they agree to participate in your study with informed consent. We talked about that last time. And then you say, all right, do you know of any other students that are a bit like you? What about your friends? And they might know other students, and they might know other students, and they might know other students. And you snowball your sample from a small number, getting larger and larger and larger, till you end up with something that's generalizable, that can be generalized more effectively. Or you go with opportunity sample. You basically find people and go, oh, I can talk to you whilst you're doing something else. Maybe you yourself are a player on Fortnite, and then just as you happen to be chatting to someone, you discover they're a student, and go, oh, can I interview you whilst I'm in the process? And you build up your sample that way. Now you can see why these would necessarily lead to non-representative samples, but might quite give you large ones or might take a long time. So although they're good methods, they won't always be practical. And I understand that, nor will they necessarily be ethical. I mean, going on Fortnite and finding out who's a student when you yourself are an adult is on dodgy ground. So you end up with practical reasoning behind non-representative samples. The final point I'm going to make here is theoretical reasons why you might not want something that is entirely representative. And that is the interpretivists. And they might say, well, how do you generalize? If people label themselves, that's more interesting to us than what we label them as. So whatever sample we get will be not representative, and we know it. And what we're aiming for is finding out how they see themselves and what that tells us about what's going on out there in the world. So an interpretivist might look for the effects of lockdown without trying to stratify or get a representative sample, because those that come forward will offer insight that they might not be looking for. So we watched some of that with the Life in Lockdown series and the people that he interviews on the street. He's no idea who he's going to come across. And that in itself led to those two people talking about conspiracy theories, for example. And that just showed an interesting take on things, something they wouldn't have looked for otherwise. And sometimes that's just what you need. So it depends what you're doing your study for as to whether or not you're going to end up learning what's out there or trying to use some kind of structure to do your sample. And I hope that's made you as interested as it makes me. I realize I'm a geek. I honestly don't care. All of which will allow you then to carry out the study. And that's where we've been using them up until now. Now, obviously, all of these basics, all of this stuff here is interesting, I think so, and helpful, obviously, and exciting in its own way. But you won't be writing an essay directly on any of these things. But without knowing them, you couldn't use what's going to come later in the course where we talk about all the different methods available. And I will be showing you interviews first, you might have noticed, to make sense of things. So for now, I hope that's giving you an in. It's giving you something to start with. It's giving you a framework. We're going to start hanging things on that framework soon, and we're going to be talking about different methods and how they are used. And I hope, even in a little way, it's made you a bit excited. Now, I know this has gone up late, and I do apologize. I had a technology failure at school, and I've left my camera there, and I've come home to fix the problem, which seems to have done the trick. So my apologies that this has gone up late. There'll be another lesson, hopefully in shorter order, tomorrow. Thank you very much. Have a lovely evening, and I shall see you in the next video.